tonight we have two very special guests. Of course, we have a lot of special guests, but Paul Dreesen has been on our show before, and Paul has covered a lot of the environmental movement and on previous shows. But tonight we're having a look at the religion of environmentalism, and then we're going to also, Paul's going to talk about his book, Eco-Imperialism. He's joined tonight by John Larrabell, who happens to be one of the editors and a writer for the New American magazine. And I brought John on because he wrote a terrific article just a few issues ago called Green Religion, and it talked about how the environmental movement has morphed from let's say an activist group and turned itself into a religion with the kind of zealots that normally you would find in a very, very strong religious sect. So with that, I would like to welcome both of our guests. Paul, would you give our listeners a little bit of your background, and then we'll move on and do the same with John?
Sure. My background is in geology and ecology in college, and then environment and natural resource law in law school. I worked for an energy trade association for Senator Bill Armstrong in the U.S. Senate here in Washington, D.C. area, then for Jim Watt with the Department of the Interior, and for the last 20-plus years I've been kind of on my own working with various think tanks doing energy, environmental, climate, malaria, and other research and writing articles on all those things.
Great, thank you. John, will you tell us a little about your background as well?
Sure. Well, I have a degree in theology, so that's kind of, I guess that ties into the whole religious aspect here when I can see that. Study Hebrew and Greek and all that stuff. And other than that, I'm not a pastor or anything, but I help out at my local church and just worked various jobs. And for the past 5 years now, I've been an editor at the New American magazine, and where I write articles occasionally. And other than that, I have very varied interests, and I've done a lot of study on my own about the environmental movement and then environmentalism and global warming. It's something I was taught as a kid in school growing up in the 80s and 90s, and when I started really researching it on my own, I just became very interested in it, and that's kind of what led me to write some of these recent articles I've done about the environmental movement, particularly this one here we're going to talk about, Green Religion.
Okay, well, that certainly is a good way to lead into my first question, and I guess I'll direct this one to you, John. I'd like to know how you came to see environmentalism as having morphed from a movement to a religion.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Basically, as I said, I was very interested in the topic, and we'd done articles about this, obviously, at the New American, and when I started working there, I realized that, hey, these guys are really, putting out a lot of good information, saying that the whole environmentalist alarmism about global warming and climate change is not only wrong, but it's factually wrong, but it's being done as a kind of a guise to implement world government, and just really it changed the way I looked at everything. And I started, as I said, doing some of my research on my own at the time, reading books and that sort of thing, and writing articles about it. And as I was writing, I just basically I could see the patterns, the behavior patterns that people were exhibiting, and the way they would react to things, and the way they would think. And it was just like, well, hey, this is what people do that are very religious or very religiously zealous. They exhibit the same behavior patterns. And what really kind of sparked it, I think, for me was I read that quote by Michael Crichton that he gave to the, where was that at? What group was that? Before the Commonwealth Club in 2003. And he was explaining how it's a religion. I said, yeah, that's exactly what I've been thinking too. And that kind of inspired me to write an article about that. This was maybe a couple of years ago, and I didn't really get around to it. I was doing other things. But that's, I guess, where the idea came from. And the more time goes on, the more it's totally apparent to me that that's the case.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the elements that turn it into a religion. But I want to go back to Paul and talk about your experiences, and we certainly got into this before on a previous show, but talking about the agenda behind environmentalism. And by that I mean agenda such as global government, UN Agenda 21, so forth. Do you agree that environmentalism has all the trappings of a religious movement?
It's all the trappings of a religious movement, but also of a big governance movement. When I got involved in the environmental movement, it was kind of around Earth Day, the very first Earth Day back in 1970 when I was an organizer on my college campus. And over the years, we took care of the problems we had back then. We cleaned up our air and our water. Our cars now emit about 3% of the pollution that they emitted back in 1970. Our coal-fired power plants put out about 85% less pollution than they did back in 1970. Everything has been cleaned up. So as we achieved all the initial goals of environmentalism, they kept shifting the goalposts, and eventually they got in a position where the focus, well, some of this goes back to Paul Ehrlich and his population bomb, but getting rid of as many people as they can on the planet, reducing population growth and eventually populations, taking control. Charles Wurster, who was one of the organizers of the original DDT ban, said if we can win on this, we can achieve a level of power and control that we never even imagined before. So that has become a big part of this. So has ending fossil fuel use and taking over with basically taking over all state and federal programs with global governance under the UN and the various environmental pressure groups. And then one more big one is redistributing the world's wealth. One of the big shots from the UN's climate program said very bluntly that the real goal of UN climate policies is nothing to do anymore with environment or climate. It's how and where and by what means they're going to redistribute the world's wealth and resources. And one good place is with this Global Climate Fund that was supposed to start out with $100 billion a year transferred from currently wealthy countries that are supposed to de-energize and de-industrialize their economies while they turn over $100 billion a year initially to kleptocrats in various poor countries. And in the next 10 to 15 years, that $100 billion a year is supposed to increase to $450 billion a year, taken from us and given to poor countries, kleptocratic countries, and that will be combined with free technology transfers. So this whole thing does take on the trappings of kind of a religious cult, but also a group that just wants tremendous power and control over the rest of the world's lives, livelihoods, and living standards with no accountability for anything they screw up or anything they do deliberately.
Well, that's certainly well said. And I have to say, one of the things, of course, you and I have talked about this before, Paul, but one of the things that's at the very heart of all this is either radical socialism or communism, because it's so obvious by the way they try to do this redistribution of wealth and have so little regard for the creation of wealth and the effort and the freedom that's required to create wealth in the first place. It's obvious that they don't have a clue what's going on.
Absolutely true. They think their food comes from the local supermarket, their energy from a whole plug in the wall. And when you look at the way they operate, it's really not so much communism as fascism. Fascism meaning state doesn't own the industries, the tools of wealth creation, but it controls them. And there are all the other aspects of fascism that we've come to know and hate so much from the 1940s in terms of how they treat people and how they silence anyone who criticizes them. And we're seeing more and more of that as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Well, John, I'd like to get off on the subject of the religion, and I know you've got in your article you talked about all the trappings of the faith, the fundamentals such as Eden and salvation and heaven and sin and all the different trappings that make environmentalism a religion. Would you kind of like to speak to our listeners and explain just exactly what you mean by that?
Well, sure. And before I start that, I just want to say, as Paul was saying, first and foremost, it is kind of more of a one government, like socialistic attempt here. But I think that's what leads to the religion, because that's the way they can get people behind it. They get the common people to really support this, because, obviously ruling classes have known throughout history that, well, if you can get people to have, some sort of a religious belief about whatever you're trying to do, you can get them to do almost anything you want, and they get really zealous about it and they'll support you. So, at its core, yes, I believe this definitely is a global government, kind of a socialist. It's about power and control of the world, and they're using it. They're kind of twisting it into a religion, but they're not calling it a religion in order to get people to follow it. The religion, as far as psychologically, it functions as a religion for people. That's kind of what I mean. But as far as the different elements of a religion, what kind of turned me onto that was, as I said before, I read a speech that Michael Crichton gave, and he was saying how you can, he says, if you look carefully, you see that environmentalism is in fact a perfect 21st century remapping of traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs and myths. And I thought, well, that's really intriguing. And I think about it. I'm like, well, that is true. As far as God, I mean, obviously you have, the environment, the earth, or Gaia, Mother Earth. And, people might say, well, we don't. Well, some people do say they worship the earth, but they might not outright say they worship the earth, but they definitely respect the earth to a point where, they revere the earth, where if you harm the earth, it's terrible. It takes the place of a god to them. And as far as Eden, being like an idyllic state before some kind of a fall into sin, the world before we humans came along and messed it up, maybe either a pre-industrial planet Earth or even a pre-human planet Earth is kind of like an Eden. It's this idyllic state that we want to get back to, but we messed up by sinning, which was, I guess you could say, industrializing Western culture, and now it's spreading out from Western culture to the rest of the world, and that's polluting, and it's cutting down the trees, and it's polluting the air and polluting the water, and things of that nature. It's using up all the resources irresponsibly, and we're killing all the animals, and that's kind of like a sin or like a fall from grace. And you have something like a salvation or even a heaven where we have to try to work. Of course, it's not a non-earthly heaven or salvation that a Christian would believe, for example, but we achieve it by correcting our mistakes, by making the earth back into this paradise. And yeah, you have all kinds of different things. The church could be seen as the United Nations, and not a church as in like a church isn't a building, obviously. The church is people, of course, but, the church, quote unquote, as in like a body that is authoritative and it makes pronouncements and it kind of runs the show. That would be like the United Nations, because most of these climate change and environmental rules are really coming from the United Nations. We see them in our own country, and other countries do them in their countries, but at the top, it's coming from the UN.
And those are really excellent points, John. If you look at the climate change, it's the same concept of the original Garden of Eden and man's sin. So with industrialization, we went from a balmy, stable climate that supposedly reigned for millennia, if not millions of years, to an unstable, catastrophic, chaotic climate because of our so-called carbon emissions, which of course are not carbon at all. It's carbon dioxide,
right?
Which
exactly.
is the miracle molecule that makes all life on Earth possible. So they gloss over all of these points of always unstable, fluctuating climate, a miracle molecule that makes life on Earth possible being turned into a nasty, toxic molecule that is destroying the planet. And again, you do have your religious cults in the UN and the EPA under the Obama administration, and they're trying to shut down our industries, our energy use, our living standards, so-called to save the planet.
Sure. And I think one of the most important facts that makes this basically a religion functionally is the fact that you have what you could say are maybe prophets or priests or something like that, religious authoritative figures. And this is just, so obvious when you see some of these, so-called environmental gurus and these scientists and even guys like Al Gore who go around and talk about this stuff and, raise the alarm about the impending disaster of global warming. It's just like the old stereotype of the prophet of doom going out there telling people to repent and, the end of the world is coming. That's exactly what these guys are doing. And, over and over and over again, they keep doing it. They've been doing it for decades, and their claims have never come true. Some of these claims they've made maybe 10, 15 years out, and those dates have already passed when they said such and such was going to happen, and it doesn't happen every single time. It doesn't ever happen, the disasters they predict. And but what happens? Well, when say a certain religious cult, when their leader makes predictions and it doesn't happen, what do? Well, they don't really seem to notice that. They still believe in the guy. They go along believing whatever he says without questioning. And, well, we just reset our date out somewhere more in the future. And that's exactly what happens with environmentalists. And the people
and I think it's also important to point out that some of these great high priests of the environment are the biggest hypocrites, Al Gore being a good example.
Oh, of course.
Tom Steyer out in California. Al Gore is
yep.
flying around in private jets and lecturing the rest of us. He has one of the biggest carbon butt prints on the planet. Tom Steyer made all his billions selling coal, and all of a sudden he's against coal and using his billions to finance all these anti-climate change programs and politicians. So you see that aspect of it, and then to just give you one quick example on climate change and how it's supposedly changing and getting worse, and yet when you look outside the window past the climate models, those computer models and all the hype and hysteria, it's been 11 and a half years since the last Category 3 to 5 hurricane hit the United States, and that is a record. The previous record was 9 years without a Category 3 to 5 hurricane. That was set in 1860 to 1890. So maybe all that extra carbon dioxide in the air is reducing hurricanes and tornadoes and droughts, because we're not seeing an increase in them for a lot of years and no increase in planetary temperatures either.
Well, one of the things that we need to mention while we're talking about this is the fact that Al Gore's hockey stick and the actual the faulty science that they use in their own examples of their so-called scientific theories are that carbon dioxide follows temperature change, not the other way around, and it lags by somewhere around 200 or 300 years. So in reality, the increase in carbon dioxide has been following the temperature changes anyway.
That's an excellent point. Even in Al Gore's movie where he gets up on the ladder and he's showing tracking how the carbon dioxide and the temperatures change, if you can really zero in on his own graph, you see that very dramatically. First you get the temperatures rising, then the carbon dioxide goes up.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think, well, it's probably because of the more than likely outgassing of CO2 from the oceans. You know, as the temperature warms, the oceans warm, and they emit more CO2 into the atmosphere, which is far, far more than what humans put into the air from industrial activity, which a lot of people don't understand that, but, you know, they think, well, we put so much into the air, how can that not do anything? But it really is minuscule compared to how much CO2 is actually in the atmosphere.
0.04% of the Earth's atmosphere.
Well, and even of that 0.04%, even of that 0.04%, the part that's from
oxygen, exactly.
Yeah, and the part that's from human activity is a small portion of the 0.04%, very small.
Yes.
Most of that is just from outgassing from the ocean. It's just already in there, and the amount of increase from what was it pre-industrial, maybe 280, 300 parts per million. Now we're about 100, 120 parts per million higher. Very, very small part of that is actually from us. You know, most of it's from natural causes. You know. But as I was saying too about the religious aspect of this, you try to explain that to people, and they see the contradictions, and they don't even notice it. They believe anything these people will say, and they take it as gospel truth, and they just go on believing it. And if you disagree with them, well, they'll try to shut you down, and that functions just like a religion.
Yeah, and one more example of all of that is the belief in sea level rise. Well, seas have risen 400 feet since the last glaciers left during the ice ages.
Exactly.
400 feet of sea level rise versus around 7 inches per century right now, which is very manageable.
Yeah, and it's not.
So the disasters aren't happening.
No,
well, and
it's
the
really,
bottom line on that sea level rise is that's been happening for, a couple of centuries at that same rate. It hasn't increased a whole lot.
Right.
Okay, John, I guess I was going to ask about your feeling, and of course, Paul, I will let you enter into this conversation. Obviously, you've got quite a good scientific background, but the fact that they don't have much science behind all these claims and behind this religion, yet they seem to be able to get people to believe that they do have a lot of science behind their claims. This is a great opportunity. Why don't we dissect that so-called science that they have and find out what they really have?
Well, let's take one example. They talk about the 97% consensus, but here's one way they obtained that. They sent a survey out to 10,000 scientists. 3,500 responded. Then they took from those 3,500, 77 people that they said were more involved in climate studies than the rest of them, and 75 of those 77 supposedly responded to 3 different questions about, well, do you think climate is changing? Do you think humans have a role? And do you think there could be serious problems in the future? And 75 out of the 77 said yes. So there's a 97% consensus. But what happened to the other 3,500 people who responded to the survey, or the other 10,000 plus who were sent the survey? Those guys were all ignored. So it's a tremendously fabricated consensus to begin with. And the second part of this is that the guys on the alarmist end of the spectrum absolutely refuse to have a discussion or debate with those of us who are climate realists and recognize that climate change is real, but that does not mean it's man-made and it's catastrophic.
Exactly.
They know they don't have the science to back up what they're saying, and therefore they just fall back on A, consensus, B, climate models, C, scaring us half to death, and D, trying to silence all of us on the realist perspective.
Well, exactly, and I think that's exactly why this, what makes it such a, I guess, functionally a religion, because for most people, you don't need this science. You can just tell them, well, the science says this, and they'll believe it. They get scared. And if they see it on the news at night that some so-and-so said the temperature is getting warmer, they believe it. they don't really have the critical thinking skills to say, okay, wait a minute, well, who's saying this? Is it really? Let me research this myself. Let me see what's really going on here. Let's read some different points of view. People who are religious zealots and involved in, some sort of a cult, well, they won't ever do that. They'll just take whatever you say at face value and just say, oh, yeah, this is exactly what's going on. I won't even question it. And if you do, you're crazy. If you do question it, something's wrong with you. And that's why I think even though, scientific data does not confirm what they're saying, it doesn't confirm it at all. They don't really have a lot of science behind it, but a lot of, quote unquote, common folks think they do have science behind it because they say they have science.
Well,
that's why it's so
one
dangerous.
of the things, Paul, I want to get to your book, Eco-Imperialism, and the reason I do is because, one of the things with religion, you would think, would be that you would be concerned about the lives of others, that you would be concerned about taking care and helping others, and yet the environmental movement, in your book Eco-Imperialism, is probably the best source I've ever seen on showing just exactly how radical environmentalism is doing the exact opposite. They're trying to deindustrialize and trying to reduce the amount of economic and industrial and let's say progress in the underdeveloped countries, to the point where a lot of these people are starving to death, and a lot of these people are in worse shape now than they were 100 years ago. Would you kind of like to talk about how you, when you wrote your book, the things that you discovered about the environmental movement?
Yeah, what I discovered about the environmental movement, aside from what I said earlier about how it constantly moves the goalposts, is that they have their agenda, their global governance agendas and so forth, but they also want to minimize the impact on their sacred earth from any economic development. So instead of doing what I think we ought to be doing, which is trying to raise people's living standards and help the world's poorest people take their God-given rightful places among Earth's healthy and prosperous people, they, number one, want to reduce living standards and health and well-being in already developed countries, and then B, minimize the improvements in living standards and energy use and economic development in the poor countries, themselves exempted from all of that, of course. They want to be at the top of the heap in the UN and other government agencies so that they can dictate to the rest of the world how the rest of the world should live. But it's kind of like Hunger Games, where the capital lives very well while the rest of the people around them don't live very well at all, live in poverty, disease, malnutrition, and early death. So I was very upset about that when I started examining a lot of my own learning over the years as studying ecology and listening to the environmental groups that I was part of for a long time, and felt I was being lied to. I kind of took the Julian Simon approach of looking and examining and thinking for myself, which is what corporations today are saying is really lacking among our students. They've learned how to recite all the propaganda they're given, but they're not taught to think for themselves. And in fact, thinking for yourself is now a major sin, because you're going against whatever your professor might be telling you, or what the media or certain politicians might be telling you. And I took a look at three major themes within the environmental movement, one of them being access to energy, and the environmentalists want to reduce access to energy. B, access to modern farming techniques, including biotechnology, GMOs, and mechanized farming, and chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides that really increase productivity from each acre of land and help improve people's lives and nutrition and living standards and longevity. And the environmentalists are against all of that. And then the third one was using insecticides and this incredibly powerful spatial insect repellent called DDT to eliminate malaria and other diseases that are carried by insects and destroy people's lives, incapacitate them for months on end, and end up killing a million of them every year. So when I examined those, I decided I needed to write a book about that and explain just exactly what the environmentalists were actually doing to the poorest people on the planet. At some point, I was reminded that it's not only happening in Africa and Asia and Latin America, the poor countries, but those same things are going on with eco-imperialism right here in the United States and Europe. So the book has been out for a while. It's been translated into Italian and Spanish and German, sold a lot of copies online and in print, and I think a lot more folks ought to be thinking about these kinds of issues.
Well, I think this is actually an excellent time, and we did put your book on our website, but with the things that are going on in our country and around the world with the radical environmental movement, and I use that term because I, too, like you, started out thinking I was an environmentalist. John, I would assume you probably felt very much the same way. We want a clean and healthful environment.
Sure.
Frankly, it's not achievable unless we are prosperous. The countries of the world that have the best environments are the countries that have been the most prosperous and have the freest societies that can innovate and can think and can do things. And one of the things that come out of the religion of environmentalism is that man is nothing more than just any other animal, and that we're not superior in any way to any of the other plants or animals on Earth, and we're just one more thing, and that is so anti-Christian and so anti-true religion that it defies logic, because without the things that we've been able to create in this country, we will never improve the environment. What do you think about that?
Let me jump in with one final comment on that, because you reminded me of Newkirk, the former head of PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. She put this very succinctly, what you're just saying. A child is a dog, is a rat, is a pig, is an insect. They're all the same. They all have the same rights. They are all equal creatures, and therefore killing off children and adults in the human race is no worse than killing off pigs and dogs and cats and bugs.
And rats.
And rats.
Yeah, that's amazing. John, what do you think about that, how that compares with what you're seeing with the religion of environmentalism?
Well, sure. You know, you definitely see the attitude. I don't really think that, well, I know that view didn't come from the environmental religion. You know, it's much older than that, that we're just animals, of course, but because, you know, people who will, I guess, be quote-unquote followers of the environmental religion typically will believe the so-called, you know, science worldview. They obviously, yes, do believe that, you know, humanity is, well, really kind of a scourge on the planet. You know, we're the planet's worst enemy. So, you know, maybe we're even worse than the animals. You know, because we're destroying the planet. You know, we're overpopulating, and we're using up all the resources, and you know, so we have to not only reduce our standard of living, but, you know, we have to reduce our numbers and stop doing a lot of the things that we're doing in the developed nations. But as Paul was saying earlier, it is true that the undeveloped nations are usually, by a pretty big margin, the most environmentally destructive, because, you know, in trying to, you know, gain a subsistence living, they're just tearing apart their landscape, and their farming methods are very, very inefficient. So they're doing more destruction to the environment. But I don't really think ultimately at the very, very top, it's not really about the environment. It's about control. It's about power, and it's about reestablishing more of a class-based kind of feudal system, as Paul was saying. The leaders exempt themselves. You don't see those people reducing their standard of living. They're going to increase their standard of living. The wealthy are bankrolling this stuff, and they're not going to become poor and be good examples for the other religious followers. They're going to just get richer and richer and richer. But they want us to become poor. So there's more of that evening out of humanity, and there's a lower class of the masses, and then there's the elites that they can use up all the resources because we're not. That's basically how it's going to be. So, but as far as not viewing humans as special, that's much older than environmental religion, but it's definitely part of it, sure.
Well, it's actually part of paganism, but we get into a total discussion of just that subject by itself.
Sure.
Paul, I was fascinated when I read eco-imperialism because you covered so many subjects that I've individually covered over the years, but you had them in one source in a really great way. I'd love to speak about Rachel Carlson and Silent Spring in the complete nonsense that pretty much eliminated DDT from being able to use as a pesticide almost worldwide. Would you talk a little bit about how that has impacted these underdeveloped and undeveloped countries?
Yeah, the key thing about DDT is that it's a very powerful, but not as good as what we have today, insect killer, but it is the longest lasting, most powerful insect repellent. It keeps vast majority of mosquitoes from even going into a house that's been sprayed along the walls or the doorways with DDT. It lasts 6 months or more. If insects come in, they are disoriented and agitated, and the mosquitoes don't bite. So it's essentially putting a mosquito net over an entire house, and it can prevent huge amounts of malaria that incapacitate and kill women and children in particular by the millions. Rachel Carson wrote her book Silent Spring because she got cancer and she blamed it on insecticides. But DDT was used to prevent typhus after World War II, to stop malaria all around the developed world. And what she said about its carcinogenic properties was disabused by William Ruckelshaus's own scientific committee. He was the very first administrator of the EPA back in 1970. He appointed a scientific commission that concluded that DDT was safe and effective and non-carcinogenic and was not destructive to most wildlife if it was used properly. Ruckelshaus never read a single page of the 9,000 pages of studies and testimony. He never attended 1 minute of the hearings that they held over 6 months, but he concluded that he would ban DDT because he had a political problem thanks to Rachel Carson and Environmental Defense Fund, and he was going to solve it by banning DDT. As a result, it eventually got taken out of even the disease control programs. And the ban happened after DDT was used to eradicate malaria in the United States and Europe. So those countries, being free of malaria, could go ahead and say, now that we're safe, we can ban this chemical that helped save us, and we'll ban it from the rest of the world where they still are fighting malaria on a daily basis. So what ended up happening is some 40 million people died needlessly over the ensuing decades because there was no access to DDT. And Rachel Carson was completely wrong, but her book was co-opted by the environmentalists to drive their own power game and prevent access to a chemical that could be life-saving and disease eradicating. So even today, there's over 1 billion people that are threatened by malaria. You've got at least 500,000 who die from malaria every year. And the environmentalists still fight not just the use of DDT as an insecticide, but the use of all insecticides and larvicides to kill the mosquitoes that transmit malaria. So we've got a problem that you just can't eradicate the malaria because of the environmental policies.
Well, and the other part of that, Paul, is that it costs so many of these countries, which have very limited money anyway, especially for the people that live there, but let's just say the government in those countries have very limited resources, and they spend a great deal of their resources fighting something or dealing with the debilitation of their own population. And it's a waste of resources. It shouldn't have to be that way.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it's really a vicious circle because the poverty causes a lot of the malaria because they don't have the resources to fight the malaria. And then the malaria causes the poverty because people can't work for months and months on end. They can't take care of their families because they're bedridden. They're spending all their money on hospitals and drugs to try to get rid of the malaria, and it just goes on and on, generation after generation.
Yeah, and it's all because they can't use one of the most effective and inexpensive pesticides ever developed, and a very safe pesticide as long as its application is done correctly. That's a tragedy. John, I guess I would like to ask you. We've got all these different groups: the communists, the socialists, the globalists, the fascists that are part of these NGOs and tax-exempt foundations that seem to be pushing an awful lot of the environmental agenda. Why are they given a free pass? And could you kind of talk about how they're using that free pass to reconstruct or regulate our federal agencies?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think those are kind of all the same group, you know. They're all basically at the top. They're the same in the way they, screw our lives up. They're basically the same thing. Communists, fascists, socialists, they're all, totalitarian. They want to control everything. But now, when you say a free pass, so what do you mean by that? Who's giving them a free pass? You mean like the U.S. citizens maybe aren't criticizing them, or what? What do you mean?
Well, what happens is that they embed themselves into every branch of government, and I saw it as a county commissioner. I was a county commissioner in Madison County, Montana, and a lot of these environmental groups come in. They offer assistance to do certain planning efforts and so forth. And the first thing they do is they bring a facilitator in from one of these organizations that has an awful lot of, supposedly a lot of expertise in a particular area. And they come in, they've been well programmed to sell a line of BS to the local governments or to the state governments, and everybody thinks they're experts. And what they end up doing then is getting kind of, by what I call a free pass, they get a way in to those different agencies, and all of a sudden they are the expert that those agencies go to for information. And it's one of those situations where it's like letting the wolf in the door. I guess that's what I'm talking about.
Well, people aren't aware of that, who's going to notice that kind of thing, nowadays? They're not being, if they're not being taught that in school, and we know they're not in the public school system, they're definitely not being taught that in college. They're not going to see it on the news. Where are they going to get it from? Unless they do their own research, or they're, listening to programs like yours, or, reading magazines like The New American, or, or reading alternative kind of books like Paul's book, things of that nature. They're going out and getting this stuff on their own. They're not going to even notice that. Somebody standing up in front of a group talking is automatically an expert in most people's mind. So they're just going to believe it, and I think and as you said, they're very clever in the way they word things, and they kind of know what to say to not get people alarmed. That's why it's important in those kind of settings to ask for the citizens to ask a lot of questions. Exactly, pin them down. Exactly, what are you going to do? As far regarding private property rights and things like that. But yeah, I think they get a free pass. They're able to do it just because the population's ignorant.
There's another aspect to this, and that is that our government agencies at the local, state, and federal level are very much infused now with this kind of thinking, with people who think this way. The people that used to believe in multiple use and environmental protection, but resource development and so forth at the same time are gone. And they've been replaced by these ideological types who don't want the development. Then they turn only to the people in the radical environmental groups as their facilitators, as their advisors, as their scientific advisory councils, and so forth. They exclude people from the corporate world, from the farmers, and from the other resource activity groups that actually know how the world works and where our bread and butter and beef and electricity come from. They are excluded because they are profit makers and therefore sinful and should not be involved in any of these conversations or decisions. So you have a very one-sided approach in all of these meetings, all the decision processes, and all the regulatory agencies to drive a particular agenda.
Yep, you're right on. That is absolutely right on the money, Paul. And I have to say, a friend of mine, Elaine Wellman, who is very knowledgeable on the indigenous peoples' issues and water and a number of other issues, mentioned to me, she said, the problem, and we're talking about Montana, she said the problem with the Montanans is that they're such nice people and they're so kind-hearted and so thoughtful. They're more than just a little bit gullible, and they always try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt.
Sure.
And in the process, they end up turning the keys to the asylum over to the lunatics.
Yeah. And I think in general,
I think
a lot of America is like that. Yeah. I think Americans in general are not everybody, of course, but in general, I think a lot of Americans are like that. They just kind of, they want to be nice and they want to get along and give people the benefit of the doubt. So they'll just believe what their leaders say.
That's part of the reason there's just this visceral reaction against what Donald Trump has been doing to reform EPA, bring some science back in, get rid of these ideological ties between the environmental and other agencies and the activist groups, and get out of the Kyoto and Paris climate treaties. That upsets the apple cart. It upsets the system that we've seen for years, and people are angry about it. The people that were in charge, the people that were making the billions of dollars from the system as it was working, are very upset about losing their place on the money train. Yeah. So this is, to me, that was the main reason I supported Donald Trump and continue to do so. I want to see him succeed in some of these ways, because in the past, the government has only grown bigger and bigger and more powerful in its ability to control our everyday lives, our living standards, our livelihoods, our liberties. It's time to rein it in a little bit. So hopefully that's going to be happening here, and hopefully this conversation that we're having is going to help aid in that process.
Yeah, and I think what you said about how these people are so upset about what Trump did, and they are. I mean, it's just unbelievable what some people are saying about this. That it upset their apple cart, it's upset their power. these are people in the media and, journalists and writers and, in the news media and, government and agencies and so on and so forth. But I think, when you see the just everyday American citizens getting upset about this, that's where the religion aspect comes in, because they believe it's like a religion. So they're told to think, oh, he's terrible and this is going to destroy the whole planet. How could he be such a horrible person? And they just don't even question that. I work with people. I work a part-time job on Saturdays at a local health food store. And, there's a number of people working there. Most of them actually are, I'd say they'd be, green religion adherents, whether they realize it or not. And just the way they react to this stuff is just unbelievable. I mean, it's just every time that they talk about this topic, it's so obvious it's a religion for these people. They don't even question it. They won't accept any other view. They believe it so passionately, and to the point where it's almost they're not even thinking. They don't even look at other views. I remember there was in the break room at this place I work at a few weeks ago. There was an article in a newspaper. Newspapers laying on the table in a break room, and a local newspaper, the Post Crescent, and there was an article saying that because of global warming, the trees are moving north. They're just packing up and moving north because it's getting too warm here. They're going north. Not literally packing up and moving, but there's the tree. They're starting to move north more and die off here. I guess that's what the article was saying. It was a short article, and they were standing around the table. These three women were in varying ages of people here. And, did you see this article? Look at this. They didn't even read it. There's a big headline and a short article. And, oh, no. Oh, it's awful. Oh, no. And I'm just thinking, I didn't say anything, but I'm like, they didn't even read the article. They don't even know. They don't even question what's going on there, if that's even true. It's just a headline, and they just pull a headline out of the sky and they believe it. I mean, that's a religious belief right there. I mean, it's
let's go beyond that for a second. Just think, more carbon dioxide in a warmer world is going to spur agricultural growth, the growth of habitats, the greening of the planet. If you go the other way, and we have a couple of degrees of cooling, and less carbon dioxide in the air, your growing seasons shrink, your arable land moves south, those trees go in the opposite direction because the climate conditions for them change. We go back toward the little ice age or even a major ice age, and think what that will do to agriculture, human nutrition, and human lives. Things will change dramatically, very much for the worse. We're far better off in a warmer, more carbon dioxide-rich world than in the opposite of that.
Oh, absolutely. And I did an article, this article I did, Green Religion, is actually the third in a series I've done over the past couple of years about the environment. And the first one was, I called it The Rise of Doublethink, and referring to Orwell's term doublethink in 1984, how the people would believe two contradictory ideas at the same time, and they wouldn't have a problem with it. It's not cognitive dissonance where people hear a contradictory idea and they just ignore it because it, goes against their worldview. They just believe both at the same time. They don't even think about it. And I say, well, people that believe, the man-made climate change is a threat, they exercise doublethink all the time because they believe, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It's gone through all these different climate, eras and the glaciations and everything and different CO2 levels in the atmosphere they can find out in the records and whatnot. They believe that, yet they believe that 400 part per million CO2 or really anything over 350 in the air is catastrophic and we're going to destroy the planet. And so back when they say during the time of the dinosaurs, CO2 levels were 1,700 parts per million, and they've been higher than that before. The Earth was just fine, and during the big glaciations, most recently, CO2 levels were very low. They were probably 180 parts per million, and the part of the country where I am right now in Wisconsin was probably covered by about a mile thick ice, they say, or more. And, well, how did that get there, and how did it go away?
Yeah, and I grew up in Wisconsin as well. I grew up right next to a quarry where I dug up a rock that shows the scratches made by the last glacier that went across Kaukauna and Green Bay where I grew up.
I'm
that's
from
real
Apple.
Climate change, man.
Yeah.
That is serious, catastrophic climate change to have a mile-high wall of ice coming down across your continent, wiping out everything in its path.
Sure. And what happens with a cooler world, with lower CO2, the Earth gets cooler, and it also gets drier, much drier. A warmer, more CO2-rich world, the atmosphere, has a warmer, wetter world is better for agriculture. And and greenhouse. I mean, you look at greenhouses where they grow plants in, and what do they do with their CO2 levels? They typically keep them over 1,000 parts per million, 1,100 parts per million if they can, which is like 2.5, 3 times what they are right now in the atmosphere. And that's good for the plants. That's why they do it. You walk into a greenhouse, what does it feel like? It feels nice and fresh in there. It's not going to kill anybody.
Yeah, and it's not just good for agriculture. It's good for humanity. It's good for our wildlife. It improves the greening of the planet, which we're seeing right now. We're seeing a 10% increase in the greenness of the whole planet thanks to slightly warmer temperatures and more CO2 in the atmosphere. And this part of the carbon dioxide cycle that we're seeing is completely ignored by the people that are screaming that it's a poison, a toxin. There's a University of Michigan professor who wrote a piece 2 months ago saying that carbon dioxide is deadlier than sarin gas. I mean, this is the kind of insanity you've got going on out there, and it's coming from the professors who are teaching our kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and actually, we're getting really close to the end of the show, and I don't want to cut this conversation short. It sounds like we need to come back at a later date and continue this discussion. But that was one of the last questions that I had, and I'd like to dedicate the last couple of minutes to this. How can we change the false teaching that controls so much of our K-12 and university education systems? What can we do to turn this propaganda on its head?
I think the main thing is to start with, of course, read my book and my articles on Town Hall and CFAC.org, other places on the internet. Read stuff that John has done, and engage your kids in conversations. Go into the schools and offer to talk about some of these things, even if it's one person a semester who offers a contrary point of view. It opens up a lot of kids' eyes, and just encourage kids to think for themselves and to question, and always read as much as they can. Challenge their professors, challenge their friends, challenge themselves just by expanding their horizons and reading things that they don't encounter in school.
Yeah, I think that's good. My opinion would be very similar to that. Just basically get the information out there. Let the truth out to expose the lie. There are many people writing books. Let's just Paul and guys. There's a number of them that are really involved in this. What's his name? Mark Morano with Climate Depot, and there's what's his name? Watts with that Watts.
Well, and Ron Arnold has certainly done a bunch of them too, and I know Paul, you're familiar with Ron for sure.
Oh yeah, Ron and I go back a long way. Roy Spencer, the climate scientist from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of solid information,
I think
and just help get it out.
Get that information out and get people to think. And I think a good idea is, too, that I recommend, I tell people is, public schools, colleges, it's going to be tough to get that in there. It's not impossible, but it's tough. I think a great idea would be just talk to people one-on-one, get it into maybe churches or something like that, where, you're going to tend to have people that aren't so, radical environmental religion, where it's going to be more acceptable. Like, hey, there's other views. Let's let them know how important this is. Go to groups where you're going to get an audience that is going to believe this right away. It's easier they're going to be more open to seeing a different view. Okay, then you can worry about, how are we going to get this into the public schools? Because a lot of public schools, some might be the exception, but a lot of them aren't even going to they think you're crazy if you say there's no global warming. I know I was taught that as a kid in school. I grew up in I was born in '79, so I was, at elementary school when they started teaching global warming, and I didn't even know. I kid you not, I did not even know that there were people who did not believe that until I was in my mid-20s.
Well, I believe in global warming and global cooling and climate change, but that doesn't mean I believe in man-made, dangerous, catastrophic.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm referring to. Yeah,
That is
that's what I'm referring to.
Well, gentlemen, I hate to do this, but we've reached the end of our radio program, and I thank you both very much for your participation in this broadcast.
Thank you.
I ask our listeners to please return next week and listen to another Connecting the Dots radio show with Dan Happel. And with that, Kelby, I turn the program over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.